In this lesson, we'll go over what keyframes are and how to create them. There are two methods of creating animations. The first method is called straight-ahead action. This is an animation method in which the animator creates frames sequentially, starting with the first frame moving on to the next frame. In this method, the animator creates frame by frame, gradually developing the motion. This method is good for creating dynamic and organic animation because it allows you to convey the unpredictability and naturalness of movement. This means that each successive frame is drawn after the previous one. The second method is called pose-to-pose, which is an animation method in which the animator first creates key phases that describe the main points of the animation. The animator then adds intermediate frames between the keyframes to create smooth and consistent motion. Thanks to the power of the computer, we only need to create the key phases. The program will calculate the intermediate phases itself. It will do this using interpolation, which we will talk about in one of the next lessons. We can use keyframes to fix a certain position of an object or a parameter value for a selected period of time. This is where the name keyframe comes from. It is the frame where we capture the key phase of the action. To insert a keyframe, we need to select the object we want to animate. Every object has transformation parameters, and we can animate any of them. For example, consider the location parameter. I will set current frame indicator to the first frame. Move the mouse cursor over one of the location axes, right-click and select Insert Keyframe. We can see that the keyframe icon has appeared on the timeline. Let's go to frame 24. Here I'm going to change the position of the ball to 3. To fix this value, we need to add another keyframe. Right-click, select Insert Keyframe. We told the program that in the first frame the location value on all axes is 0. In the 24th frame the location value on the z-axis changes to 3. And between the keyframes the ball takes an intermediate position, which is calculated by the program. This is how the animation is created. When the last keyframe with the changed parameter ends, the animation stops. We can move keyframes on the timeline by selecting a keyframe, left-clicking it and moving it. Or press the G hotkey and move the keyframe. By moving keyframes we can change the duration of the animation. I moved the last keyframe to frame 48 and the duration of the animation doubled. By moving the last keyframe closer to the first, I shortened the duration of the animation. To delete a keyframe, select it and press delete. Or use the X hotkey to delete keyframes. To delete all the keyframes in the timeline area, press the A key and delete them with the delete key or the X hotkey. However, the value of the parameter that was changed remains the same as it was in the frame where current frame indicator was at that moment. To keep the object in its original position after deleting keyframes, move the current frame indicator to the first keyframe with a value of 0 on the z-axis, and then delete it. If we have deleted keyframes where a parameter has already been changed, we can reset the position of the object to 0 by pressing the viewport hotkey Alt-G while in the viewport. I'll put the current frame indicator back on the first frame. We can insert keyframes not only by right-clicking, but also by moving the mouse cursor over the desired parameter and pressing the I hotkey. I go to frame 24, change the z-axis position to 3, press I. The second keyframe is inserted. But this is not the most convenient way either. We can select an object and press hotkey I in the viewport. We have a list of parameters we can animate. I choose location. On frame 24, I'll move the ball, hotkey G Z3. Press I, location. As we move the current frame indicator around the timeline, we see the animated parameters change color. If the indicator is outside the keyframes, the parameters are green. If the indicator is on keyframes, they are yellow, which means that the parameter is fixed with keyframes for that time moment. If I change a parameter value but not fixing it by updating the keyframe, it turns orange. When I move the current frame indicator, the changes I made are not saved because I did not update the keyframe that was previously inserted. In order for the change to be saved, I need to update the keyframe after the change by reinserting it. I'll remove keyframes. In the Keying tab, we can specify the parameter for which keyframes will be inserted by default, so that we don't have to select the right parameter every time. I will choose the default location. Now, when I click the viewport hotkey I, the keyframe for location is automatically inserted. At frame 24, I move the ball again to GZ3. I press I and the keyframe for the location is instantly inserted. I'm going to delete keyframes. Clear the keying tab. There are other ways. You have to insert the initial keyframe, then make changes to the frame you want. And when the cursor is in the timeline area, I press the I hotkey, insert keyframes for all channels appears. Or you can select a channel and insert keyframes for selected channels only. And if I need to do a simple animation on only one axis, I can move the mouse cursor to the desired axis, right-click and select Insert Single Keyframe. I only animated the Z-axis rotation. But if we are going to animate many objects or characters with many controllers, these ways of adding keyframes are time-consuming and slow. To speed up the process, you can use the button I mentioned in the first lesson. This is the Auto Keying button. Activate it. Every time we move an object or change its other parameters, the program will automatically insert keyframes and fix the changes. And if we change the parameters on another frame, the new keyframes will automatically apply the changes. I will delete keyframes, disable automatic keyframe insertion, reset all changes with Alt-G, Alt-S, Alt-R hotkeys. Let's turn on automatic keyframes insert again. If we want to make an animation with auto keying so that the ball is at 0 position in the first frame, and it moves to GZ3 in frame 24, when we change the position, the keyframe is automatically inserted, but we didn't have the starting position fixed, and it's in a changed position throughout the timeline. So, with auto keying, we need to insert keyframes for the start position and then make changes. Auto keying has settings. In my case, I needed to animate only location. But auto keying inserts keyframes for all settings by default. We can set in keying tab location. In auto keying settings, select only active keying set. On the first frame I insert keyframes, on the 24th frame I move GZ3 and automatically keyframes are inserted only for location. If this is turned off, auto keying will insert keyframes for all parameters, even though I only inserted keyframes for location on the first frame. To delete keyframes for parameters that we are not animating, you can right-click on them and select Delete Keyframes. Or you can hover over the parameter and press Alt-I. Another way is to select a parameter channel and delete it. Channels are displayed on the left area of the timeline. Here you can select a channel, it will be highlighted in yellow, and press Delete. You can select multiple channels and delete them in the same way. As you can see, the deleted parameters are no longer animated. Let's take a look at channels area and why we have so many keyframe icons on the timeline. There is a summary group in the channel list. Here are its keyframes on the timeline. The summary group is the main group in the hierarchy. By moving its keyframes, we move the keyframes of all the channels down in the hierarchy. Below is the object group, and here are its keyframes. I'm going to add the basketball 02 collection. In the viewport, I will select both balls. In the channel list, the basketball 02 object group appears next to the basketball object group. When I select the keyframe of the basketball 02 group and move it, only the keyframes of the channels that are inside the basketball 02 group are moved. The keyframes in the basketball group are not moved. When I moved the keyframe of the basketball 02 group, in the summary group new keyframe appeared, telling us that keyframes appeared on this frame within the hierarchy. Below in the hierarchy there are keyframes for actions. We will consider what an action is in another lesson. Further down in the hierarchy is the object transform group. And for all the parameters of the transformations that we animate, there are also channels within this group. Each of these channels has its own keyframes. By moving the object transforms keyframe, we move the keyframes of each channel lower in the hierarchy on the timeline. In addition, we can move the keyframe of each channel, located down the hierarchy. In our case, these are the X, Y, Z position axis channels. When we move the keyframe of a single channel, the keyframes of the other channels remain in place. And for the groups higher in the hierarchy, a keyframe is added to a new frame of the timeline, indicating that a keyframe on this frame has been inserted for a parameter located inside the hierarchy. If I move the start keyframe Z location to frame 13, the animation for that axis starts at frame 13, but for the other axis it still starts at frame 1. On the X and Y location we have no will change in the parameter values. On the timeline between the first and the next keyframe we see a gray bar when the keyframes are not selected and a yellow bar when they are selected. Remember, this tells us that there is no change between these keyframes and that both keyframes have the same value for this parameter. To summarize, with this hierarchy of channels, we can control the keyframes of all objects or controllers at once, a group of individual parameters, or each individual parameter. Now, if I select both objects, the timeline will show the keyframes of both objects. If I select one object, only its keyframes remain on the timeline. If I deselect all objects, there are no keyframes on the timeline. In the View tab, we can enable the display of all keyframes in the scene, even if no objects are selected. This is useful when we need to work with the animation of multiple objects. Or we can enable the display of keyframes of only selected objects if we need to edit the animation of only one object and we have many animated objects in the scene. We can lock individual channels by clicking the lock icon in the channel list. In this case, the keyframes of the locked channel will remain in place no matter how we try to move them. There is a hotkey for this action. We can select a channel and it will be highlighted in yellow. By pressing the Tab hotkey in the timeline area, we will lock it. And with the same hotkey we can unlock it. We can disable a channel's animation without deleting its keyframes. To do this, I have to uncheck the channels checkbox, and the Disable Channels animation does not play. When I check the box, the animation returns. Using the wrench icon, we can turn the curves modifiers on and off. This will be discussed in the curves lesson. In the next video, we'll take a look at interpolation.